Kristiana Almeida. With me today is Emily Barany. We are with Visionality Partners. Emily is our founder and CEO. I am our senior project manager. Essentially what we're doing right now is kind of this like quick series. So some of you had joined us at the beginning of COVID when we were kind of thinking about how to pivot, how to move into like the brave new world of not knowing what was going on in the world around us. And today we're actually starting to talk about coming out of COVID. There's going to be this interesting transition period, and then there's going to be the post-COVID world in which we don't know what any of that looks like right now, but how to lead knowing that you don't know what the future looks like. This is going to be an ongoing series. The first topic that we wanted to tackle today, though, was events. And as we promised in our invitation, we are going to keep this to 25 minutes of speaking because everybody, as great as Zoom has been for helping us run our businesses and organizations, we're all over Zoom right now. And so Emily and I are both coming to you from our homes. I'm in my guest room. She is in her living room. We both have dogs. And so there might be some dog interruptions. Mine's sleeping behind me. Hers is sitting on the floor next to her. And so we'll do 25 minutes of talking, and then we'll open it for questions if you have any, but you're also welcome to drop off at any time that feels good to you. So I am starting my 25-minute timer now. And with that, we're going to get going.
So I decided on this topic because it has been the number one question that I have gotten for 14 months. When will we be back to normal? What's going to happen? What do you think is the future for events? So we wanted to first talk a little bit about what that pivot looked like for us. And then we're going to talk about things to consider as you're rebuilding your event portfolio. And then what predictions we have for what's going to happen for events at least this year and next year, and then kind of who knows. So for Visionality, we had to make a really quick pivot. We've got our project manager, Cecily, on as well. So her event was the first one that we took digital, the first main big event that we took digital. So in 6 weeks after the shutdown, we moved a 600-person 4-day conference that's normally in Monterey onto a platform. And this is a pretty high-end platform. It's called vFairs, which is custom built from the ground up. So it's really nice and appropriate for events that have a pretty big venue budget because it's pretty spendy, and especially events where like the physical location has some kind of important meaning to the attendees. So
why was it important for us to continue to have this type of event, even though the world was going to be very understanding if it didn't happen, seeing as we were in a shutdown situation? So why was this still important to host an event?
Money. So a huge reason was money. So a big chunk of our clients literally could not afford a gap in their budget, where, especially for the events that we had in Q2 and Q3, they already had collected a lot of sponsor money. There aren't many nonprofits who have a full 12 months or even 24 months of operating expenses in the bank. And so having, number one, already taken in that money, but more importantly, already budgeted for that income, it's not like all of our expenses just disappeared because the pandemic happened. And so we ran into a lot of challenges in Q3 and Q4 with organizations who just hit pause or canceled their events because they then lost that revenue and had sort of a smaller footing to rebuild their event portfolio in sort of the second half of the year. So that was a huge challenge. It was a huge education process to help sponsors understand that events can still matter and you can still get meaningful engagement with the attendees, and then redesigning that package. Again, not just to be a logo on a background, which is fine, but like, how do we on a digital platform replicate meaningful engagement with the attendees? You can't get a physical handshake. So what does a digital handshake look like? So that's number one. Number two, for all of our clients, their mission, vision, values mattered even more than it did before the pandemic. So a lot of our clients are doing mental and emotional health and wellness. We've got, domestic violence. it's really important work. And, you know, the things that were really important coming into the pandemic just got deeper and more important continuing. So yes, for the organization's health, it was important to maintain that cash flow so they could keep their doors open, quite simply, but also the attendees needed that information and that connection even more than ever.
Yeah.
So,
and I want to hop in on this because you brought up a couple of interesting points that are worth like talking about. And one is like the sponsor experience, because I think for a lot of nonprofits, it really used to be logo placement. And then reimagining what sponsorship really was, or like a digital sponsorship experience could be, was really important. And I think one of the most powerful things about that first event that we did was really asking those sponsors to do the opening videos and welcome videos for those speaking events. And it wasn't, and I think the best part about that was really about them talking about why they support the mission of the organization and why supporting the mission of the organization was so important. So it was this really wonderful kind of like message shift. Instead of the company talking about why they're great, they really put the spotlight onto the nonprofit. And I think that that was a really powerful shift that we saw, and it really paid dividends for them as well. I think the other aspect that we were seeing in those early days really had a lot to do. Some organizations just canceled altogether, which was fair. They kept, you know, they asked people to donate their ticket price, which was fair. But I think that especially some clients, like their mission was so involved in what the political spotlight was, or like the cultural spotlight was in the moment of, you know, last spring and summer. And so it was vitally important for them to continue their messaging, you know, especially when things were disconnected. And so as you know, and the next thing I want you to talk about, Emily, is now that we got through that first hurdle, like what are some of the main trends that we as an organization have seen within digital events?
yeah, so something that I think took us certainly, but most people a minute to figure out is what is the appropriate expected engagement and therefore platform for the different events. And so what we ended up doing was sort of differentiating our clients into 3 or 4 different levels. So we started, you know, is the event really more of a celebration or a connection event? And how do we design the attendee interaction to be as close to, you know, those mingling, like networking kind of events as possible? So then we would put it on Zoom, we would, you know, host some small breakouts, that kind of thing, compared to the really big, the more educational, you know, clients who had CEUs or some kind of professional development component to their events. And then how do we design, number one, the attendee experience, the attendee takeaways, the speaker expectations and experience, and then of course the sponsor experience and engagement based on really the underlying needs of the client and those attendees. So I think that was like a big learning curve for a lot of us, of like, Zoom was a great starting point. It wasn't a great finishing point. And so what are the appropriate applications for each of the different tools that we had in our disposal?
And I think another interesting aspect to this for us and our clients was the cost differentiation between the type of event that you wanted to do. I think for a lot of organizations, it was actually a bit of a sticker shock that there was even a cost associated with doing a digital event. And that was a really big wake up call for a couple of people. They're like, well, it's online. Like I just turn on my computer and the thing's there. And it's like, there is actually a lot that goes into creating a good digital experience. You can't just do an online experience, an offline experience online. Like you really have to think through what it is those goals are that Emily mentioned, but also like how do some of these interactions take place online and how do they not take place online, and what can transfer over and what will never transfer over online. And that was a really interesting opportunity for us to then break out what are like the 3 main types of digital events that do happen or that we can help put on, with that little bit of strategy behind it. And then like, because something similar to this, where an organization wants to do a quick presentation, Zoom is a really great platform for that. We have all learned though that Zoom is not a really good like networking platform, because people are talking over each other, or then you're having to manage breakout rooms. Like that's your only option. So how do you create spaces online for networking? And how do you create spaces online for connection with sponsors? And so I think that was because Zoom is not a Zoom is not a tool that can be used for everything. And that was a really good opportunity, like probably month 6 or so was when we started wildly diversifying our tool set based on the type of events that we wanted to do. So now that we kind of talked through like what are the types of events and what we were learning through that, like let's start to look forward into the future. We were able to look back. It's time to like have that opportunity of, what do you think, Emily, are kind of the biggest barriers to entry going back to in-person in the next 6 to 12 months?
Well, of course, safety. And so one thing that Visionality has been working on for probably like 3 months is not only what is a safe event reopening plan, but also what's an ethical reopening plan. So yes, we can ask every attendee, every physical person in the room to show a vaccination card or a negative test. Yes, we can do that. What about the janitors? What about the catering staff? What about the AV staff? What about our staff? And so we've at Visionality have decided to take a pretty conservative approach to how we're going to re-enter the in-person event world. Certainly, we're not going to send any of our staff into the field until they've been fully vaccinated. But we're actually taking that to the next step, which is talking to all of our venues and vendors about how they're handling vaccination of their own staff. We've got lots of perceived control over the attendees, asking those requirements. But then I think it's really important as we look at how do we ethically reopen, and number one, keep making the table bigger. That's been a huge push for Visionality over the last 14 months, but then also take very careful care of everyone who's associated with this event. So
those a little bit. So what do you mean by making the table bigger?
Yeah, so one of the incredible positive outcomes of the pandemic was equity and access. And so individuals who for physical reasons could not be in a space, and maybe that's some kind of disability or you're not comfortable being in a room full of people, but then also finances. We, with an event that we recently ran for the attendees who filled out the survey, 67% of them, it was the first time attending the conference. And we believe a huge chunk of that was financial reasons. They didn't have to take the time off work to get to the conference. They didn't have to pay travel expenses. They didn't have to, pay for food and board at the event. And so having a digital or a hybrid experience absolutely makes a table bigger for all kinds of different reasons. It also did make the table smaller for some people. So if for some reason you're really not able to connect with someone digitally, then probably the last 14 months didn't work very well for you. And so one thing that we're really excited about exploring as we move into a hybrid event experience is how do we keep the really good things that did come out of the pandemic and also add back in the things that we were missing when we had to go fully remote.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point to just make sure that we do give space for, even though there have been a lot of positives for access and people who were able to go to events that they weren't able to go to, and even the fundraising events that we ran, we asked our clients to eliminate their ticket price, because a $150 to $200 like ticket price is actually really prohibitive for a lot of people to support an organization, when creating a donor that can give like $10 a month is actually more powerful than somebody coming to your really expensive luncheon. But on the flip side of that, I think we also learned from again, we asked for feedback from every single event that we did. There are some people that never wanted to do digital events again. They were never comfortable being online, and that's fair. And that's why it's really important to figure out, like, what does hybrid look like? Because hybrid allows you to like include those people who cannot afford a $200 like price tag to go to a lunch, or don't want to pay $200 for moral reasons to go to lunch, or from the conference side of it, $250 to attend something digitally versus $2,500, including travel expenses, meals, etc. That's a huge barrier that you're then eliminating to allow people access to information and education. And so, like, what are the major considerations for hybrid events? Emily, as we're kind of looking at, this is what the model is probably going to be. Why is it going to be hybrid? And what are some of the factors that nonprofits need to look at, like, as they're looking at why or why not to go with the hybrid option?
Well, one of the coolest things that we saw, especially with sort of more recent events, so the events that we're seeing that are like the second time digital, was an increase in sponsorships to cover those low-income attendees. And so I think there's a real opportunity, again, to make the table bigger, but also get those seats paid for or underwritten by your sponsors. And so, looking again, just purely financially at the dollars and cents of running a hybrid event, the cost to add a digital attendee is close to nothing. It may be $100 if you're paying per ticket to your hybrid platform, but it's not that much money compared to the cost to underwrite an in-person ticket. And so I'm really, really excited to add an additional opportunity for sponsors to underwrite that kind of ticket in the same way that we've always had sponsors underwrite scholarship tickets. This is just a way to amplify that effect. Give me another question, Kristiana.
I got you, girl. So what have been, like, for nonprofits that want, there's probably, fall is going to be really hot, right? Like, so fall and winter, I'm expecting everybody's going to want to be back in person. Everyone's going to want their in-person hugs again. So when thinking about venue choices, like, what are considerations for venues looking at fall and winter for nonprofits? And what are some of the stumbling blocks that you're seeing there?
So I've reached out to a lot of our venues and vendors. A huge portion of them are not taking reservations, period. They have a list, they have an interest list, but they, period, end of story, are not taking reservations. One venue that we have gone to for years and years and years for a lot of our educational events, period, they're not taking reservations until January. So I'm feeling this disconnect between our clients who are like, okay, things are opening up. I just had my first lunch indoors. I'm able to hang out with some people who have been vaccinated without masks. When do I get to have my in-person event? So I feel this like market desire to get back in person, but I'm not seeing the supply side being ready to accommodate that. There are some vendors who are ready today, and there are some who never stopped delivering that in-person experience. We are, again, taking a slower approach because we are prioritizing safety and the equity of everyone involved. And so I do want to just caution everyone a little bit. I know that you probably have donors and sponsors saying, when can I shake people's hands again? And there are so many things to consider, and we're taking more of a slow approach just so we can make sure that we're doing things in line with the mission, vision, and values of our company, but also our clients. So we're seeing hesitancy in venues. Specifically with venues, we've got huge space concerns. So again, that venue that I mentioned that we have events at all the time, that's not even booking till January, their major salon that holds over 300 people, well, they're at 1/3 capacity. They max out at 72 people. So number one, that speaks to the scope and the experience that you can expect to deliver, even if you could magically book an event in August. If you can only have 72 people and you're used to having 350, like that's a very different experience, attendee experience, number one. It also really speaks to the finances of that event. If you're having to pay the same price or more, by the way, because it's costing more to clean those venues, general overhead is up. So if you are booking an event, call all of your vendors and see what rate sheet they're booking at right now. We do have one venue who gave us the heads up that they're still booking at 2019 prices. So I'm like, we got to get our 2022 event on the calendar before they update their rate sheet, because it will go up. So in terms of finances, for the venue itself, your expenses will go up and your attendance will go down.
And I think that's an interesting point, especially because it really speaks to overhead. And overhead is really like a really important term in the nonprofit community, even though sometimes it gives me heartburn. But if you're spending, a lot of organizations will spend upwards of $100,000 to be putting on an event. And so if you're spending $100,000 to only put, a third of the number of people in the room, what does your overhead look like? And can you actually justify that overhead to your donor base later down the road? And that's a really important distinction. For organizations to be looking at, is like, you're not going to get your return on investment the way that you were before. And because if you were spending 30% overhead to put on an event, which is what we've seen a lot in the sector, you're going to be spending 50 to 60%. And would any donor or would any like fundraiser be able to justify that to their board or to their donors? Like, hey, we spent 60% of our budget on overhead to put on this event. Like, cool. That's not what we want. We have 4.5 minutes left because we are keeping this to 25 minutes as promised. So Emily, I want you to kind of walk us through like maybe the 3 big takeaways for everybody that's in our little digital room today.
Yeah, so our 3 big takeaways, number 1 are safety. We've talked about that a lot. I do not want to be the one who has to call all of you on this Zoom and say, like, hey, Ken, I really think you're great. You came to our event last week and I tested positive. So you need to now quarantine and get a test. And so, of course, we can't eliminate every single safety risk. I mean, 2 years ago, I could have tripped and fallen at an event, right? So there are inherent risks in an in-person event, but part of our duty as event coordinators is to the safety of our attendees and our whole event staff and team. So we are going to prioritize safety over booking more events. Number 2 is to maintain a bigger table. So what we were able to see is that the pandemic made the table bigger for a lot of different people. And so what I would hate to see is organizations backsliding on that like really important goal. We mentioned too, it did make the table smaller for some people. So now that we move into hybrid, how do we continue to make the table bigger? And number 3, and most importantly, is what's your communications plan? So doing new things is really scary. No one remember having to go to your first Zoom or your first event on a digital platform? It was terrifying. No one knew how to act. And so doing a really proactive communications plan about how a digital event works, doing a video platform tour, explaining to your sponsors how it's going to work and why it's important. So I think, especially in times of change, it's really important to over communicate, and you're going to see that investment return dividends with people actually showing up and then understanding like what they can expect from a hybrid event.
And I think that's really important because there's like a major like safety psychology behind that too, right? Like when you know exactly what's going on, like what you're walking into, you feel safer. And so if you are going to be doing in-person events, like even putting in notes about like what are appropriate socially distanced greetings that are acceptable at your venue. That might seem really silly, but it's going to help a lot of people who may not feel safe with physical contact show up, knowing that like, okay, there is these 3 like I can do my jazz hands, I can do the elbow, I can do the air high five from over here. But even like that level of like what people can expect, like from that in-person perspective, is really important. And I think for a lot of people, it's not being told what to do, that they feel like they have a choice in the situation. And that's that actually like loops back to like trauma resiliency. Like this, it has been a traumatic event. And so the more people feel like they have control of their re-entry into normalcy, the more likely they are to actually move through this like safely and securely. So if you do end up going hybrid, definitely make sure that you are communicating what the digital option is, how to participate, what the in-person option is, and the exact protocols on how to participate physically as well. So with that, we have 45 seconds. Emily, I'm going to have you give us your closing thoughts, and then we're going to hit the buzzer and open for questions.
A hybrid event does not mean having an in-person event that you video. It means you're managing two events. You're managing an in-person event experience and a digital event experience. So you have to think about what is the platform that you're using, and maybe it's Zoom, but it's probably not. Again, it depends on what the event type and goals are. It is going to be more expensive because you are still paying for that venue and you're paying for the digital platform. And you have to be thoughtful again about the way that you design the interactions between the in-person people and the digital people.
And with that, we are done with our presentation aspect of this, and we would like to open it to questions. Again, we wanted to make sure that we're sticking to our part of this. Feel free to pop questions into the chat box, and then we'll take them. Ken was the first one in there.
All right, what did you find were the most used and valued features of digital event platforms? So it depended on the type of the event. So, you know, networking events, celebrations did okay on Zoom. And we, did the breakouts so that we had sort of that, like, we could replicate that small group functionality. But once we got into more complicated events like educational events, we toured 20 platforms, 20. And a couple of things that we looked for, of course, price. There's a huge range in price, but also know that you get what you pay for. And what we saw during the pandemic was a lot of new platforms getting into the digital event space. And in software design, you can prioritize features or you can prioritize stability. And so number one, the features for a hybrid platform will be different than the features for a purely digital platform. And I recommend doing some pretty deep research as you're choosing a hybrid platform to see how long they've been doing this and to ask those questions. Like, tell me how on your release train, how you are prioritizing stability over features, and go for stability because it's really hard when your platform is not stable. Features are great. We all love features, but I would prefer stability. And the great example is Zoom, right? It's not all bells and whistles. It's a stable platform.
Yeah. I also want to jump in on that, but just like we paid for some like very fancy features, like one-on-one networking, or we had this like roulette networking. Nobody really liked, and we found that nobody really likes to do one-on-one networking online, which was a really great learning opportunity, because we thought that like that is a really good in-person thing that people love. Like I love grabbing this person, to the side for just 5 minutes, catching up, networking, going on to the next person, catching up, networking. But we actually found that group networking was far more used than the individual networking portions of it. And then also just from a sponsorship standpoint, we found that those corporate sponsors really liked having a kind of suite of tools available to them. However, those people who do a lot of like individual sponsorship, like for instance, like somebody's private family foundation or just an individual sponsor, they don't want those features. They don't want necessarily like that that profile available to them. So I think like also if you know that you're doing an event with a lot of individual sponsors versus corporate sponsors, your platform is going to be a little different based on that as well. And so those were two really big learning points. And then the third area that we thought was really interesting is that like making sure that people can easily access shareable resources. So for whether it's like a slide deck or like a downloadable form or something along those lines. Like I remember that the president from Janet Grufus, or her from Montecito Bacon Trust, she had her BlackBerry Pie recipe that was downloadable, and a lot of people downloaded it. You know, it was a nice little takeaway, like for attendees. But so yeah, so being able to have just like fun resources or just like useful resources available for attendees to download as well. So
we also looked for two things. Number one, we preferred to have ticket sales embedded into the platform that we chose. So when we had that separate, there was a little bit of confusion. It's gotten better, like as we get into the pandemic of like people got into the groove of like, I need to put the registration information into my calendar. But things were a little bit easier when the platform did sell the tickets. And then one thing that was a complete surprise to me was actually like the real estate design of the digital platform. So the one we ended up picking for, and again, this speaks to like, you have to think differently now that we're going into hybrid, but when we were picking a purely digital platform, we didn't want an app because it was one more barrier of entry that we thought some of our attendees wouldn't be able to overcome. So we wanted something that was web-based. Now, as we move into hybrid, you might want something with an app because, right, then our in-person attendees can interface with our digital attendees. But still, I think for a digital attendee, I would want the option to have it be web-based versus purely app-based. It just increases, again, equity and access. The other thing, we chose the platform that we did because it kind of looked like Facebook. So the physical layout of the screen was very similar to Facebook, where you have the navigation menu on the left, you've got the chat on the right, and you got all the content in the middle. And so our thought was subconsciously, you step into this new room and it's not a completely new experience. It's a little familiar because you've kind of hung out on a website that physically looks similar.
And then our next question is 3 types of digital events. Could we list those? And I'll actually take this one because so we have like major conferences. So anywhere from like 200 to 600 people. And we have a very robust platform that we use that for. And so, and these are just the 3 types of events that our company has chosen to do so that we can be experts in at least some areas instead of the Jill of all trades. Mm-hmm. So major conferences in the digital space was one of them that has a very like much higher price tag. We also found this kind of like nice middle space as it pertained to fundraising events. And so we were using, again, a different software, to run those because the presentation needed to be different. And then the third type of event that we were doing was kind of these like much smaller kind of like meeting style events, almost like this, like a little more like small educational or even just like small outreach opportunities. So those were the 3 types that we were doing. And then, so it was small meetings, celebrations, fundraisers, and then major conferences. And then we had very specific platforms and strategies for each of those because, again, we learned pretty quickly and we learned by making mistakes. That's the only way that you learn. And we learned because we basically had done a fundraising event through our conference platform and decided and learned very quickly that that was not the correct tool for that. So yeah, those are the 3 types of events that we had been specializing in, and we're going to be looking to do hybrid versions of this upcoming year.
Well, and one thing that you mentioned is like having the right tool for the job. And so as an example, Zoom does not share video well. Like there are way too many factors between when I hit share and when you watch that video. It's not going to be perfect. And so going back to making mistakes, we had one major fundraiser that had videos and they spent a lot of money designing these gorgeous videos only to have them choppy and the audio not synced. And so we have we use a program called OBS, when our clients want to share videos, because it's the only way to do a really nice, clean video share and also get that same interaction, but not bump up to that more complicated conference platform that's not necessary for a fundraising type event. So really understanding what are the design elements within your program and then picking the right platform that allows for those different elements.
Any other questions today? We're here to be to have our brains picked over coffee. I'm almost done with my cup of coffee, so I might be talking fast at this point.
Me too.
Okay, we'll give it about 30 seconds, but you know, if this is a good good time for you to hop off and get on when you're with your day, we super love that you spent some time with us this morning. You can always email us as well. I'm Kristiana at VISIONALITYPartners.com. This is Emily at VISIONALITYPartners.com. You're at least above me on my screen, so that's why I'm pointing up. But otherwise, thank you guys so much for spending some time with us this morning. We'll do a follow-up email again with just kind of like a recap of what we discussed today. But we'll also be hosting a couple of other of these as well to take on some of these other kind of big topics. So be looking for digital fundraising, be looking for you know, campaigns, board development, etc. So we got a couple things up our sleeve. But thank you for taking the time with us this morning, and we hope you all have a lovely Wednesday afternoon.
Yes.
Bye, friends.